Hello, I'm Sleight, the editor of International Construction magazine, and welcome to this video which looks at the 2014 edition of the Yellow Table. This is a study published in our April edition, and it looks at the world's 50 largest manufacturers of construction equipment. Now, if you don't subscribe to the magazine, you can buy this as a standalone report in our information store. So really what the Yellow Table is both a league table of the world's 50 biggest manufacturers as well as a market study. So here we have the top 10 manufacturers in this year's study. The first thing you notice is that all the companies that were there last year were there again this year. However, there has been some shuffling around. First of all, near the top, Volvo and Hitachi have swapped places, and that's something they've done for the last few years, so perhaps not the most significant development. But the thing I would say is significant about this year's top 10 is the falls for the two major Chinese manufacturers, Zoomlion and Sany, which have dropped places compared to where they were last year. And as you can see here, this has had a benefit for Liebherr and Terex. The decline for Chinese manufacturers in general was one of the key trends last year, and the other things that had an impact on the Yellow Table as a whole was the downturn in global mining activity and the depreciation of the Japanese yen. The overall result was a 10% decline in revenues for the top 50. Their total revenues were $163 billion last year, compared to $186 billion in the previous year's study. And that, of course, was based on 2012 revenues. The downturn in mining had an impact because the Yellow Table looks at construction equipment manufacturers, and although we exclude companies that purely make capital goods for mining, it is quite a grey area, and it's understandable that a downturn in mining is going to hit on companies that make earth-moving equipment in particular. These tend to be the larger companies in the Yellow Table, and one symptom of this is that the top 10's revenues accounted for 62.8% of the top 50's revenues, compared to a much bigger slice, 66.5% a year ago. The second factor I mentioned was the depreciation of the Japanese yen. Now, this has been really good news for Japanese exporters because it makes their goods cheaper on overseas markets, or it means they have bigger profits, or both even. But in terms of the Yellow Table, which is calculated in US dollar terms, it has had quite a profound effect this year, and on the whole, it's been negative. This table looks at revenues for the 5 biggest Japanese manufacturers: Komatsu, Hitachi, Kobelco, Tadano and Sumitomo. And it looks at their calendar year revenues rather than the fiscal year revenues that they tend to report. Now, what you can see here is that revenues were up in yen terms last year by a marginal 2.1%, but that was pretty good given that the rest of the industry saw a downturn. However, the big shift in exchange rates meant that in dollar terms it was quite a downturn, 16.6% lower in 2013 than 2012. The other decisive factor in this year's Yellow Table was the downturn for Chinese manufacturers. This year their revenues accounted for 14.4% of the top 50's total, and that was down from 15% last year and 16.9% in 2011. And that figure in 2011 corresponded to the high tide mark that came with the height of China's stimulus building boom. In absolute terms, revenues last year were $23.5 billion, and that compares to the height for Chinese manufacturers of $30.6 billion total revenues. So that's a downturn of about 23% in just 2 years. So that's just a quick rundown of some of the key findings of this year's Yellow Table study. As I mentioned at the start, the Yellow Table is published in the April 2014 edition of International Construction, and obviously the magazine includes a lot more data and information and analysis than we're able to talk about here. If you don't subscribe to the magazine, you can buy the Yellow Table as a standalone report from our information store, and you can either buy just this year's report or a compendium of the previous 5 years' reports. So that's it from me. Thanks for watching.